Hello and welcome to Note Doctors. My name is Paul.
My name is Jen.
My name is Ben.
And we are your hosts. We are all university music theory instructors who are passionate about music theory and music theory instruction. In this podcast, we will be talking about all things theory with some of the best music theory teachers in the country. If you want to know more about music theory and the most effective and innovative ways to teach it, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome back to Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. So today our very special guest is Dr. Charles Leinberger. And in this episode, we are going to talk about film music. So we've talked a bit about film music in numerous episodes, but it's usually been a kind of a side topic. But today that is the focus of our conversation. And Charles just has a wealth of knowledge with doing research on film music for decades. And it's really fun just to talk with him and to hear his stories and his research areas, which is really great. So, Ben, tell us a little bit more about Dr. Leinberger.
Sure. Charles Francis Leinberger is a professor of music at the University of Texas at El Paso, or UTEP, where he teaches music theory and film musicology. He is the author of Diguelo, No Mercy for the Losers, the enduring role of the solo trumpet in the soundtrack of the Old West. That was published in the International Trumpet Guild Journal, 39.3. And also Ennio Morricone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, a film score guide, published by Scarecrow Press in 2004. And he is a contributing author to the Anthology of Music in the Western, Notes from the Frontier. That's published by Routledge, 2011. He is also a freelance trumpet player.
When you talk about film music, you're talking about different domains, not just, harmony and melody and rhythm and timbre, but you can't talk about film music without talking about rock and roll, without talking about jazz, right? Think of, all the MTV era movies like Top Gun and Footloose and Flashdance and Fame, or in the 60s, Hard Day's Night and Help and atonality. You have serialism in Jerry Goldsmith's original Planet of the Apes and so on. You can't talk about film music without being ready to talk about not just domains but different genres, because it can include anything. There's nothing is excluded from film music. And that's one thing that I find fascinating about it, because it's so multifaceted in that way.
So, Charles, we are so happy to have you on the podcast to talk with you about music theory and integrating film music into that. And so we're excited to talk with you about your expertise and your background in that. And because, as we talked before, the recording, film music is just something all of our students are listening to, whether they know it or not. They're watching movies and things like that, streaming on Disney Plus or Netflix, all those things. And so that's an area that we need to be able to talk about in music theory. But before we get to that, we always like to ask our guests just a little bit about how they got into teaching music theory. Was it part writing? Was it sight singing that really got you into it, or maybe melodic dictation? What got you turned on to music theory? That's what I want to do for my career.
Well, that took a long time. I started my musical life as just a band kid in school, right? Mm-hmm. And to me, band was more important than math or science or history. And I knew I wanted to get a music degree, and I knew I wanted to be a musician. And my goal was just to play trumpet. That was everything that made me happy was just playing trumpet. So my bachelor's degree is actually in applied trumpet, where I went to school, Northern Arizona University. At the time, the only options were performance or music ed. And I really didn't want to be a music teacher. I didn't want to be a band director. I thought, I watched my band director in high school, and I thought, man, he spends so much time solving other people's problems. He looks like he's really stressed out, the poor guy. I don't want to do that. So I got a performance degree, and then when I went to graduate school, I went to University of Miami for my master's degree, and there was a trumpet teacher there I really wanted to study with. His name is Gilbert Johnson, and at the time, he had just retired from the Philadelphia Orchestra. but I knew getting in as a trumpet major would be really competitive. So I applied as a theory major because theory was always easy for me, and I got in. So I got my master's degree in music theory, and the joke was theory without composition. That's like bacon without eggs. But it was that's what I did. And
wait, theory is the bacon. I feel like theory is the eggs. Composition is definitely the bacon.
But what got me really originally interested in music theory was in high school. My band director, bless his heart, offered to stay after school and teach a theory class to anyone who just wanted to learn theory. So that was really my first introduction to music theory, and it was like I know this already. We had a workbook, I don't remember the name, where you would answer a problem and then turn the page to see the answer, right? And it was like, well, I already knew the answer. All of these. Yeah, that's going to be one more sharp. And yeah, that's going to be 12/8 meter. And that's going to be, a perfect fifth and so on. So I knew theory was something I was good at. And now that I've been, or I was, an undergraduate music advisor, I tell students, get a degree in something you're already good at, right? So that was my thing I was already good at. So my master's degree was in theory, but then after taking like a 12-year break, I went back for the PhD, and I had actually applied as a trumpet major, and then before classes started, I went out to dinner with my girlfriend at the time, later my fiance, and now my wife. And I said, honey, I'm thinking, if I get another trumpet degree, it's going to be kind of hard, looking for work because the market's always tough and it's only getting tougher. But what do you think if I got a theory degree, and then I'd look for a job, teaching theory? And I'd be a professor. And then when we got married, you'd be a professor's wife. What do you think about that? And she goes, yeah, okay, we'll do that. So at University of Arizona, the PhD in music theory includes two minors. One in music, which was trumpet performance. That was kind of like completed my picture. And then they required a non-music major, or a minor. A minor in something other than music. And I didn't know what to do. So I walked around campus. I went to different departments. I went to communications and journalism, and I might have gone to history and some places like that. And I'd walk in and I say, hello, I'm Charles Leinberger. I'm working on a PhD in music theory. I'm interested in a doctoral minor from your department. And they would look at me kind of strange and go, yeah, I don't think we do that. Sorry. But then I went to media arts. And they loved the idea. They said, do you have a minute? You need to meet with an advisor right now. Because in media arts, you have all these people talking about film and television and now video games, and they're all frustrated music theorists. They want to talk about music, and they, in film and in media, but they just don't have the right terminology. And the idea of having a music theorist in their classroom was really appealing to them. So they said, whatever we need to do, we're going to make this work. You're going to be a media arts minor. And I said, great, I'm a media arts minor. Well, then one of my music professors, Dr. Timothy Kolosik, a wonderful guy, he's retired now, told me, your minor areas of study should enhance your dissertation research. And I said, well, let's see. Trumpet, everyone's doing lecture recitals on trumpet and mouthpieces and lead pipes and stuff. But media arts, how could I do a media arts related theory topic, right? So obviously the idea was to study a film score. So I started doing some research, and I knew I needed to find, knowing that film music was almost always not published in print, had to find an archive somewhere that had some resources. And after doing a little digging around, I found out about the Warner Brothers archive at USC and also the Max Steiner archive at Brigham Young. And I went to both of them, and we watched a whole lot of Max Steiner movies: Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, Key Largo, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, The Big Sleep, and the one that really kind of captured my attention was Now Voyager, this 1942 Bette Davis movie that Max Steiner won an Academy Award for his music. and I thought, well, I'm going to write a dissertation on this. So I made the arrangements. I went to Warner Brothers. I had they let me use for a while a copy of the handwritten score, the orchestrated score by Hugo Friedhofer for Now Voyager, and it's a leitmotif score. And my advisor at the time had a lot of experience in analyzing leitmotif composers like Richard Strauss and Wagner and so many others. And he was intrigued by the idea, but he really didn't know a lot about film music or Max Steiner, which was to my advantage. You don't want to pick a dissertation topic that your advisor knows a lot more than you do, because
very true.
You make a little mistake and they'll know. But so that's how I ended up with the media arts minor. That's how I ended up. That was my first major film score analysis project, was my dissertation and Now Voyager. And I could tell you what happened after the dissertation, but you probably have more questions.
Yeah, we can stop there. It just made me think about you, Ben, and your experience as a trumpet player who wanted to be a trumpet player but not a band director, and then going into theory. It's kind of a mirror image there.
It really is. We have very similar backgrounds, and I really resonated with the people are already writing about mouthpiece types and embouchures and warm-up routines. It's like, how many different warm-up routines can you possibly theorize for the trumpet? But people seem to keep doing it, and I guess keep doing it with some success, since it keeps going on in perpetuity. But it just wasn't really something that I thought I could really see myself doing long term, and we have a similar story in that regard for sure. I found my niche teaching theory, and I really got a lot of fulfillment from it. And I'm sure you have as well. And I have to say, though, a difference. I was not interested in film music at all, really, when I did my dissertation. I've kind of come back to it more recently, kind of in relation to my students. What is it that really my students are interested in, and what is it, the music that they're consuming on a daily basis? What is it that they're watching on Netflix? What is it that they're watching, as Paul said, on Disney Plus? And like, why does that music work? What makes the villain? What makes the superhero? How has the superhero theme evolved over the years? Because the superhero theme doesn't necessarily sound the same in the 2010s as it does earlier, So that's the kind of thing that got me going. But, it's so great to have you here, because you were interested on it very early on, and that gives you all of this, scaffolding and foundation to build on. So that's really a fascinating part of your story for me. My follow-up question was, how did you get into film music? But we already covered that part, and maybe we could talk about, as a follow-up to kind of my point, about some of the different approaches to teaching it. Because I think there are people out there that say, I really want to incorporate some film music. Maybe it's just something like Darth Vader's theme or something. But is there a way that you can incorporate that? And what are the things that we should know when we go out there and try to incorporate film music into our classes? Or if we're designing a specific class, what are the things we could start with in your experience?
Well, there's, in my opinion, there's two very distinct type of students who would be interested in a class on film music. For the music major, people who read music and understand musical terminology, it could be more of a history class, kind of maybe a chronology of composers, starting with people who wrote for silent film and then early sound film, the jazz singer, and then the Max Steiner scores for RKO and Warner Brothers, through John Williams, Michael Giacchino, James Horner, all the more recent ones. Because you would expect a music student who's already had some a musical background, but also a music history background, to be able to put things in perspective. Like, oh, this person was writing film music the same as Aaron Copland, and wait, didn't Aaron Copland do a film score? And this person was writing these film scores the same time as Leonard Bernstein was, did this music, and so on. So I'd expect that kind of an approach to work well with the music major. But for the non-music major, I do teach a class in film music for non-majors. Bachelor of Arts students can take it for their what's called the Fine Arts Block Elective. And for them, it's really a matter of, it's like music appreciation goes to the movies. It's not so much a chronology of the most important composers, because that's something that they're probably not going to remember or care too much about. It's more, how has going to the movies and what you hear in a movie theater changed and why? Going back to silent film, and you'd walk in and you'd hear someone playing ragtime piano, and then the early sound films with synchronized sound and my mind just went blank. Vitaphone and the early sound on film technology, and then stereo sound and Cinerama and VistaVision and CinemaScope. And then you get the full color widescreen formats, and then Dolby Stereo, and then digital, and how what you hear and what you experience in a movie theater for those 2 or 2.5 hours has changed because of technology, because of economics, because of pop culture, sometimes because of politics. And I found that Hollywood. And probably film studios around the world in general, don't incorporate new technology to make better movies. They incorporate new technology to make more money. And if the new technology, whether it's better or not, if it's unproven, they're going to be really hesitant about that. In early sound film was a very difficult process because sound films lost money and silent films made money. So who would want to make a sound film when you can make money with a good silent film? So how that has changed over the last 100+ years, and man, this is a great time to be in a movie audience. We have the best theaters, the best seats, the best digital surround sound, the best digital images, the best CGI of any generation in history. What a great time to be going to the movies. And you get to hear music by all these great composers. It's wonderful. So when I teach the class for non-music majors, I take that approach, and I found that the James Bueller and David Neumeyer hearing the movies is a really good fit for that student population.
Yeah, that's great. I always start with my freshman theory classes. One of the first things I'll ask is, what are you listening to right now? And they tell me, and then I listen to it, and we talk about it in class. A lot of times there's a lot of overlap, but I'll just, while I'm grading something, I'll throw on a couple of their songs in the background that they told me they're listening to, or artists that they're listening to, and just get a feel for what that sounds like. But one of the common threads is always that they love film music. They want to talk about, either video game music or film music that they're hearing in that way. And I'm always like, I really want to incorporate more of that into my freshman level classes, to help reinforce topics we're learning and things like that. But of course, one of the big challenges is that means transcription, and oftentimes it means transcription at a really high level because there's a lot of parts and there's a lot of things going on. So do you have any tips or tricks for incorporating that music into the class? Maybe there are some things that don't require staff notation that you can use film music for.
Man, I'm really in the same boat. I'd like to be able to incorporate more into the undergraduate theory sequence. It's hard to do. There are things that we come across anyway that can be related to a film music topic. For example, I'm always coming across, the Bach C minor Passacaglia, and I say, hey, remember that scene in The Godfather during the baptism, and you hear this organ music? Well, it's based on this. Does that sound familiar? And they go, oh yeah, that does sound familiar. If the leitmotif pops up, I can easily go off and place a few leitmotifs on the piano without having to do much transcription work and so on. But that's something that is hard to do. film music does not appear in a lot of undergraduate theory texts, and I understand why. The same problem with any contemporary music is it's too expensive to
Yep.
license.
Yep.
So it's kind of an ongoing problem, and I wish I had a better answer for you, but it sounds like you're doing the best you can. And
Well, I have definitely stolen from Ben. When I teach mode mixture in Theory 2, I always include that raised law in minor, and we listen to the various Marvel themes and things like that to hear that kind of superhero sound of that, major sixth in a minor key. So I definitely have used some of that music, but they love it. If you can use anything from a TV show, a video game, anything like that in class, the students are automatically so much more engaged.
yeah. Last spring at the Texas SMT, Ben did a wonderful presentation that I really enjoyed.
With Xiao Yun.
on that
with
raised,
Xiao Yun, yeah.
with the raised law in minor, and making for that major four chord, and that got me thinking about my composer Ennio Morricone and how he uses what I call a hybrid modality. It's part Aeolian and part Dorian. So, but before I go into that, would you mind if I just talk about how I ended up researching Ennio Morricone?
Yeah, I
Go
think
for
that
it.
would be
Okay.
great. And maybe even for some of our listeners who were born in the year 2000, give us a brief. I just found out that one of my my theory graders had on her Spotify year-long recap, because Spotify does these things where they'll show you the songs or artists that they listen to the most. That the Note Doctors podcast was on her year-long thing.
Awesome.
So Caroline, if you're listening to this, shout out. But she was born probably in the year 2000 or later, and may not know who Ennio Morricone is. So maybe give us a brief little bio of who he was and why he's
Okay.
so important.
Okay, so he was born in 1928. He grew up in Rome. He was a child prodigy. Went to the we call it Saint Cecilia, the Santa Cecilia Conservatory in Rome. Studied composition, studied trumpet. He was a child prodigy, and he ended up working for RCA as a record producer in Rome for many years. So he had a strong classical background. He had a strong pop music background, a strong marketing background. Well, he went to school with when he was like in 5th or 6th grade with a kid named Sergio Leone. And many years later, they met again. Sergio Leone was directing his first full-length feature film, Per un pugno di dollari, or literally for a handful of dollars, or fistful of dollars is how we know it. And Morricone was his composer. And so he wrote these really intriguing scores for these Italian westerns. Some people call them spaghetti westerns, but the Italians get very offended when you do that. And they were unlike anything in a Hollywood western, right? Hollywood composers like Alfred Newman and Dmitri Tiomkin and Elmer Bernstein, they were writing for these big 19th century sounding romantic orchestras. And they were writing in major and minor keys. And then along comes this Italian, and he's writing in these weird modes that's like Aeolian and Dorian, and he's throwing in these weird instruments that no one's heard in a film score, like a Jew's harp or an ocarina. And he throws into westerns that take place in the 1860s and 1870s an electric guitar. Who would do that? That doesn't make any sense. It's an anachronism. So that was really the what I call the antithesis of the Hollywood film style, the film score, right? So Hollywood, these big orchestras, that's our thesis. The opposite is our antithesis, this European sound. Well, over time, the two come together in a synthesized sound where Hollywood film started sounding more like the Italians, like Two Mules for Sister Sarah is a Hollywood Western with Clint Eastwood, and that has electric guitar in it. And the Italians started to sound a little more Hollywood, maybe not so much. But one of the things that made his music so unique was that raised law in minor. So the way I like to describe his hybrid modality is it's like Aeolian and Dorian in that for his harmonies he uses both the natural and the raised sixth scale degree. I call it the union set. I have a diagram with circles that overlap. I think it's called a Venn diagram, where his modality is really the union set for his harmony. The union set of Aeolian and Dorian, but his melodies are made out of the intersection set of Aeolian and Dorian in that they don't contain the sixth scale degree at all. And then there's a subset of that melody pitch class set called the microcell. So when I started researching him for a book, I didn't tell you the backstory of the book. I'll get to that soon. I had read of his, he uses a technique that he calls the microcell technique. And I read that in an article by a very fine Italian musicologist who passed away several years ago, Sergio Michelli. And I got to meet Maestro Morricone in Rome in 2003. My wife and I went there. And I asked him through my interpreter if he could explain the microcell technique. And he said no. he said, if I explain it, you'll write about it and other people will imitate it, and I don't want them to do that. Okay? But I actually ended up finding out more about his microcell technique than he wanted me to find out, because after my book, I got a email from a fellow who said he was kind of an independent researcher. He lived in Rome. He wrote articles for a Morricone fan magazine and had interviewed some of Morricone's collaborators, and he had some very important documents for me to see. So I got on a plane and flew to Illinois and met this man, and he had in his possession the handwritten score for this cue near the end of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where Tuco, Eli Wallach, gets to the graveyard and is searching for the grave where he thinks the gold is buried. Mm-hmm. Are you guys familiar with that movie?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the cue is called The Ecstasy of Gold. So I had the copy of the handwritten score. So I did what anyone would do. I went home and transcribed it into Finale. And in doing so, I noticed this small little group of notes that he manipulated in very clever ways throughout the entire cue. And I thought, well, I wonder if there's a name for that technique, and yet I know there's something called the microcell technique, but I don't know what it is. So my theory is that was his microcell technique, and the microcell is actually a subset of his six-note melody pitch class set, and so on. And then in the middle of all of that is our tonic, which was A. So that was how I ended up knowing that part of his modality experiments, and in fact, when I met with him, he played the Dorian scale and said, "Do you know that scale?" And I said, "Oh yeah, because you use that. I know you use that." Let me tell you a little bit. So that's my story about the raised law in minor, the raised sixth scale degree. Mm-hmm. But let me give you, if we have time, a little bit of backstory on how I ended up researching him after doing a dissertation on Max Steiner. So after a dissertation, what do you want to do? You want to take your dissertation that 3 people read and turn it into a book so more people can read it. Well, as it turns out, someone else had just written a book on Max Steiner's Now Voyager.
Oh, so, you're too late.
Yes.
All that time wasted.
Oh,
yeah, and actually our research apparently overlapped. We visited the Max Steiner archive at Brigham Young, within maybe a few months or a year of each other.
Wow.
Her name is Kate Dobney. She's a wonderful person. She wrote a book on Max Steiner's film score for Greenwood Press. It's called A Film Score Guide, and she ended up being the editor of a series of film score guides for Scarecrow Press. And she asked me if I had researched any composer besides Max Steiner. Well, let me go back in time to when I was a media arts minor. For part of that minor, I needed to take a class called Research Seminar. So I signed up for Research Seminar, and the topic was technology. It was taught by someone from the political science department, and we spent the entire time talking about intellectual property and copyright law and AT&T. And she expected us to dedicate an immense amount of time to this class. Well, I'm trying to finish my dissertation, so I dropped the class. The next semester, I took research seminar again, and the topic was the films of Clint Eastwood. So as part of that, I ended up writing a paper on the good, the bad, and the ugly, because both the teacher and I knew that there was something special about the music. I didn't know what it was. So I wrote a little paper on Morricone for my class in graduate school, and pretty much forgot about that. Finished my dissertation, started teaching theory at UTEP. Well, after I wrote a book review on Kate Dobsney's book on Now Voyager, she said, I'm editor of a series of books, and did you research any other film composers? And I mentioned my little paper on Ennio Morricone and the good, the bad, and the ugly. And she said, well, someone was going to write a book on him for our series, but they're not going to do it. Would you like to do it? So I said, yes, right? Because I'm tenure track. Someone just offered me a book deal. Of course I would say yes. So I started doing research, and there was obviously a lot to learn because I was so unfamiliar with him. Then that's how my wife and I ended up going to Rome, and my book was published in 2004, I think. But Ennio Morricone, for those of you too young to know, really became famous through these Italian westerns, the Clint Eastwood so-called spaghetti westerns. Fistful of Dollars for a Few Dollars More, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He did wonderful music for Once Upon a Time in the West with Charles Bronson and Henry Fonda. He did other westerns too, some lesser-known westerns, and that was really his early style period.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I think we'll have to play in post-production a little clip of the ooh.
Oh yeah,
because everyone knows
Right.
that, that kind of that dual kind of, what is it, a whistle or what? I'm not sure what instrument that is.
Okay, so in a typical leitmotif score, every character gets their own leitmotif. In his score, he used that same leitmotif for the three main characters, but with a different sound, a different timbre. Right? So the Clint Eastwood is a soprano recorder, like the little recorder the kids play. Lee Van Cleef character, everyone calls him Angel Eyes. He's the bad guy. It was a bass ocarina, this ceramic woodwind instrument, but the bass form is very rare. And then for the ugly, the Eli Wallach character, it was a combination of someone singing with doing wah wah, like doing some of that, and I think it was something metallic like a muted trumpet. But for the that part, it was a voice. It was a human voice for that character. But every character had a different one. So that was his unique spin on a leitmotif technique, was to use the same theme for the three characters, which makes sense because deep down inside they're really all the same character, aren't they?
They want the same thing.
They're all gunfighters, and they're willing to kill people for the same, buried treasure, literally buried treasure that they're looking for. So that kind of reflected the sameness of the characters, and yet at the same time the distinction between the characters, which was ingenious. I mean, that's just brilliant. Then he was making some Hollywood scores or scores for Hollywood films in the 80s and 90s. Well, Once Upon a Time in America was actually filmed in Hollywood. It's a Sergio Leone film starring Robert De Niro and James Woods. And then for a lot of the 1990s and early 2000s, he was working with the Italian director Giuseppe Tornatore, doing these wonderful romantic Italian films. Now, in Italy, their romantic films are not like our Hollywood rom-coms, right? It's not a romantic comedy. It's a romance. And they all have to do with relationships and the passage of time. And there is some humor in there, but it's they're really wonderful. Cinema Paradiso is probably the best known example. He was nominated for an Academy Award for Malena, which is a wonderful Italian film starring the Italian actress Monica Bellucci, who was just beautiful. And he was doing actually all of Tornatore scores, and recently Giuseppe Tornatore did a documentary on Morricone called Ennio. So he people born since 2000 might know some of these Italian films, but maybe not so much now. If they watched the Academy Awards, they would have seen him win the award for his score for Quentin Tarantino's Hateful Eight.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's probably how most current college students might recognize him from that moment in our film history.
Well, I find it so interesting as you're talking about his use of instrumentation as a way of developing a musical idea, and also about kind of expressing the meaning of the film. And I think about other composers that might be doing that now, that are just using different sounds, and that novelty is what grabs you. I think about like John Williams' Jaws theme. No, just two notes, right?
Right.
So novel, like so simple, but unlike anything else. Or like the Hans Zimmer big horn, like the Brahm that hums in Inception, or even I don't know if you've watched The Mandalorian, the Disney
Oh,
Plus.
the music's great.
But the film score composer Ludwig Göransson, I think, uses this. It's kind of like an ocarina type of weird flute sound, which is very not Star Wars like at all.
Well, but The Mandalorian is a Western.
Right. And so I think like thinking about the ways that these composers use instrumentation, not only to express a story, but also to create something that's unique, that stands out, that makes that movie different, is such a fascinating thing to think about.
Well, or even to completely change the tone of something. Like, I've been watching The Crown. I've thought of this several times while we've been talking, but been watching season 5 of The Crown. And there's lots of kind of mundane isn't the right word, but sort of like normal things happening, I guess, if you're the queen. But they're building up to they're ultimately building up to, I think, the death of Princess Diana. And so there's all these moments where seemingly mundane things are happening, just normal exchanges between family members or whatever, but there's this like aggressive descending half step, low brass kind of sound that's like and it has the partimento, right? It syncs the whole way every time, and it's really unsettling. Like like otherwise you might not feel a whole lot of tension in what's happening at all, but that one musical element changes everything, and it keeps showing up at these really unique times where you would not expect tense music to occur, but they've used it now across several episodes, and it's very obviously building towards, the eventual divorce between, Princess Diana and Charles, and then her eventual death, because they've already introduced Dodi Fayed and all of that. So anyway, it's just, music can really impact how you're experiencing a dialogue and completely turn it in a direction that it might not go without it. And I think that's what draws our students to it too.
Yes, composers. The kind of the default approach to writing music or writing a leitmotif would just be to enhance the mood of the scene that's already there. But if a clever composer will use the music to tell the audience something that they wouldn't otherwise know at all. There's a wonderful scene in Now Voyager where the Bette Davis character, she goes on a cruise and falls in love with a married man. And she comes back home to Boston where she lives with her mother. And the married man, his name is Jerry, sends her flowers. And her mother wants to know who sent the flowers. So she confronts Charlotte, the Bette Davis character, and said, "Where did those flowers come from?" And she says, "Well, they came from New York. The address is on the box." And she goes, "You know what I mean. What person sent those flowers?" And she doesn't say, but during that scene you hear Jerry's leitmotif, which is Max Steiner's way of letting the audience know what it is that, the secret that Charlotte's keeping. It's brilliant. To do, and there's so many examples of that in film, and Bueller and Neumeier call it counterpoint, when the music is not just there to accompany the film, but actually but by being the opposite of what you're experiencing, really draws attention to that, to the scene by showing what's opposite of it.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, one thing that I'm kind of picking up from our discussion is that when you talk about film music and you bring that into class, or maybe it's its own class in your case, it really does require you to address lots of different musical domains. Like, you can't talk about film music and just completely leave out timbre, because it's central to what's actually going on. You can't leave out like the narrative, because like the music is part of the narrative. You can't leave out a melodic element. Well, are you going to talk about motifs? Hopefully, because like that's what defines the characters in the film score, are the motifs. It's not just a harmonic approach. I think that's one of the best things that I've kind of found in my teaching, is that, asking students, whether it's in a composition assignment or whether it's in just a short kind of prompt that they respond to musically, is asking questions in all those different domains. What is a particular rhythmic cell? Like, I asked my students the other day to come up with a rhythmic cell. And they're like, what do you mean by rhythmic cell? And I'm like, well, think of like one of the opening trailers of a movie that you've recently watched. What is like the rhythmic bit that defines that? Because a lot of times it's a repeated thing, and you could take lots of different rhythmic cells and have them.
Is that
do
Indiana
different
Jones?
things.
Yeah.
I was
It
thinking
sounded like
of,
the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, the trombones.
that could be a lot of different things, right? I mean,
Good. But that's how the
it
Avengers
was
movie started.
challenging. Avengers
Right?
is the one I was thinking of, because you all know I'm a
I'm
big
so
Marvel
old school.
person. But
Me too.
yeah, a lot of those
But
different rhythmic cells can really have an impact. What is it that you want to come up with when it's rhythmic cell, and then how does that apply? What timbre comes in next? That matters.
But yeah, I agree completely that when you talk about film music, you're talking about different domains, not just harmony and melody and rhythm and timbre, but you can't talk about film music without talking about rock and roll, without talking about jazz, right? Think of all the MTV era movies like Top Gun and Footloose and Flashdance and Fame, or in the '60s, Hard Day's Night and Help and the who was it who wrote the Dirty Harry movies? Niehaus, with these big band jazz sounds.
Yeah.
So it's like, and atonality. You have serialism in Jerry Goldsmith's original Planet of the Apes and so on. You can't talk about film music without being ready to talk about not just domains but different genres, because it can include anything. Nothing is excluded from film music. And that's one thing that I find fascinating about it, because it's so multifaceted in that way.
So I have theory majors here at DBU. If we have students who are interested in doing research in film music, what are some avenues they can take? What are some uncharted territories out there?
Well, the first thing that most people learn is that you can't just order a copy of the score online, right?
Yeah.
I'm what people describe as an archival researcher, right? If I want to study a film score and there's a copy in an archive somewhere, I'll go and study it. And you really need to be flexible. It's not like putting Roman numerals on a score. You really need to look at it with an open mind and try to figure out, what is the composer really trying to do here and how is he doing it? But so that's what I do. I don't write a lot about social issues related to film, and I know some people do, and it's very important. Kate Dobney's book, And Now Voyager, talks about the women's films of the World War II era, and how, because so many men were in the armed services, Warner Brothers very cleverly made movies just for a female audience. And that never occurred to me as someone studying film music, what kind of audience that not just the studio, but probably the composer had in mind as well. But I'm a music theorist. I bring the music theory element to film music studies, and I really have trouble completing what I set out to do without being able to look at a score. Because in the film, there's sound effects and dialogue going on with the music, and sometimes you can't exactly understand what music was going on there. And that's one thing I enjoyed about that handwritten score from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was being able to find what I believe is the microcell technique, and yet with all these things going on, sound effects and so on, it just these complex sounds layered upon other sounds. What did the composer really write? It's so hard to tell. So I like to get my hands on a manuscript. The Warner Brothers Archive at USC in Los Angeles has all these scores, I believe, up from like the 1940s up through like the mid 70s. Oh, wow. So I went there. I was doing an article for the International Trumpet Guild on the solo trumpet in Westerns. And I went to study Dmitri Tiomkin's music for Rio Bravo that has this trumpet solo in it they call the Degueo, which actually turned out to be a major influence on the Italian Westerns, but that's probably a topic for a whole nother discussion. But yeah, so aspiring film music researchers, if you're going to do an archive research, some kind of a score analysis, there are challenges. Be prepared to do some traveling, be prepared to maybe spend a little money. But if you're clever, there are scores out there. And hopefully that situation will improve. There's this horror story of, I think it was MGM, threw out hundreds and hundreds of boxes of scores and parts, and they ended up in a landfill under a freeway in Los Angeles. Ugh. Have you heard that story?
No, that's terrible.
No. Yeah, and there's this one fellow, the editor of the Journal of Film Music. His name is Bill Rozar, who is trying to raise money to dig up these boxes from the MGM archive that are under a freeway. So,
wow.
Wow.
So it all depends on the studio, and if they're willing to preserve or not preserve these documents that to them are no longer, may have much value because they have the film, they have the copyright, they own everything, and if those boxes of handwritten scores aren't making them money, why do they need it? Mm-hmm. But for someone who's doing research, and trying to figure out what was the composer trying to do and how is he or she trying to do it, these are priceless. Man, I can't imagine if it wasn't for the Warner Brothers Archive and a few other archives, I would have been able to do any of the research I feel comfortable about having finished.
I will add on to that one of the groups that I'm a part of, I think it's a Facebook group, has some videos that are available on YouTube through Film Music Analysis YouTube. And those have been good, even for just sharing in class. When you play something in class without the score, and we discussed this a little bit with Nicole Biamonte as well. I said, my students sometimes get lost. I'm playing a pop song and they're not looking at anything and they're a bit lost. And what measure are you talking about? Whereas if they have something in front of them, I can say, look, there, and I point to it, Mm-hmm. And some of the YouTube videos help in class where I can refer to certain parts or sections because they have the score. And a lot of times they have the scene playing with it. It's not a lot of different film scenes, but there are some that are available on YouTube that you could probably try to incorporate some of those things. Raiders March is on there, for example. Mm-hmm. You can see the score reduction with some of the scenes and things. And it's really nice to use. Yeah, it's really nice to use. But they're not all there. There's just a couple ones here and there that people have put together. And one of my students actually I was researching, and I found out that one of my students had put together some of these score reductions for Star Wars.
Wow.
So shout out David McCauley. There you are. You'll get some more YouTube followers, hopefully, from that.
I think it's really neat to look at the composer's hand. And when you were doing your research and things, was it hard to transcribe? Did you find things that were like, are you sure this is the right thing? Or what was that like?
for Max Steiner and his orchestrator Hugo Friedhofer, it was pretty easy. Max Steiner would like write funny little notes in the margin and things like that. For Ennio Morricone, man, that was a challenge because everything's in Italian and he has really bad handwriting. So even I had a good friend and colleague who passed away several years ago who would like help translate my correspondences with Morricone, and he had trouble figuring out what he was trying to say. There was another score of his. In 2011, I was in Burbank and I visited the Warner Brothers studio, and the music librarian at the time, who has since retired, was very welcoming and had gone to the trouble of making some of Morricone's Hollywood film scores available to me. And I ended up with a scanned copy of Correspondence. In 1994, it's a movie with Michael Douglas and Demi Moore, based on a Michael Crichton book of the same name. No, not Correspondence. That's a Giuseppe Tornatore. It's Disclosure. That's the name of it. Disclosure, a Michael Crichton book and movie. I can't remember who directed it. But it's so hard to read his handwriting. And there was one word that I was stuck for like days, and it turned out because the photocopy wasn't very good. It was Ottavino, which is the Italian word for piccolo. Yeah, and you would think, well, piccolo is Italian. Why wouldn't they just call it flauto piccolo? But they don't. They call it the Ottavino, and it was poorly. His handwriting and part of the first letter was missing on the photocopy, so it was really hard to interpret his and interpret it correctly. And just like in the days of Johann Sebastian Bach writing figured bass, they're always looking for shortcuts, right? How to abbreviate things. So he would in one place in The Ecstasy of Gold, he would use Roman numerals for the measure numbers, and then when he wanted those measures to appear later, he would just write those Roman numerals again as his own shorthand. Max Steiner was always writing come sopra, which means just like the previous time or something like that. So and if the previous time is missing, that's another problem. If they say this is just like real 5 cue number 2, and you don't have real 5 cue number 2, then it's back to the drawing board. So there are challenges. Because when a composer writes it, they're not writing for someone to analyze it later. They're writing because they need to deliver a score on time and under budget.
Exactly right. I mean, I tell my students all the time is that theory almost always comes after the composition, right? And in film music, certainly that's the case.
Yeah.
If you have these composers who are working on tight budgets, tight timelines, they are trying to be as efficient, right, as possible. So they're using shortcuts and shorthand. And in now, contemporary films, they're oftentimes the main composer maybe just writes the theme or the themes, and then there's this army of unknown composers who actually write the music,
Yes.
And so it's a very different process, but it's never with the intention of, okay, this music is going to be studied, or perhaps maybe now composers might think like that, but certainly probably not when Morricone was writing his his Western music, that he ever thought probably that a music school would be studying his music, right?
Yeah. Well, day one of Theory 1, when I teach it, I always quote Walter Piston, who said that music theory is not a set of rules for how music will be written in the future, but it's a set of observations based on how music was written in the past.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Spot on.
Yeah. And what you just referred to a second ago reminded me of Hans Zimmer, who is he's successful because he's a good businessman, right? He delivers a score on time and under budget, but does he write every note that you hear? No. A friend of mine saw No Time to Die before I saw it, and he said, wow, Hans Zimmer music with that big orchestral sound. And then I saw it, and I thought, that's John Barry from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. That's what that big, beautiful orchestral sound is. So, yeah. So not every note in a score is written by the person who is the music director, so to speak. But it's a business. It's very much like an assembly line. When the composer hands off the music to the orchestrator, and while the orchestrator's orchestrating it, the composer's writing the next score, and the conductor is recording the score that came before. And there used to be copyists, right? The orchestrator would hand the orchestral score to a part copyist who would make handwritten copies for the orchestra. And I can't remember who told me the story, but it used to be that when they record film scores, they'd always have two takes. One, to fix the mistakes in the handwritten parts, and two is what you hear in the film. Well, now that you can create parts literally with the click of a mouse, there's no more mistakes in the scores, so now they record it once. And if you're playing in the orchestra, you need to get it right the first time, or they'll call someone else next time. Yeah, it's amazing. It's even though it's a business and a craft, the level of artistry is what continues to amaze me and makes it so enjoyable.
Well, this has been such a treat to chat with you about film music and all kind of thinking about how things come together to make an image and to express a story, and all the things that go into writing the music, not just the notes on the page, but the story, how the composer can create extra meaning or other meanings through their music. But we do like to always end our episodes with a little bit of a rapid fire segment with our guests.
Wow, nice. Okay.
So what we do is we just ask, each of us will ask just a short little question, and you just give your just hot take, one little bit kind of answer to it, and we'll have a good time. So Jen or Ben, do you have a question?
I can go.
I have one. You go, Ben.
Maybe it's too obvious, but you have to tell us your favorite movie.
My favorite movie. It is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but not because I wrote about it. It's great storytelling. It's beautiful cinematography. It's intriguing music. It's well acted. I had the pleasure of doing a phone interview with Eli Wallach, and what a funny, sweet man, and a very versatile actor. But yeah, it has everything I look for in a movie: good guys, bad guys.
Awesome. Okay, my question is there a good film score melody or maybe harmony or rhythm or something like that that is good to use in an aural skills class?
Well, that's a tricky one, Jen.
Yeah. Good to use. I'm drawing a blank because when I think of aural skills, I'm thinking, well, are you looking for a melody for a dictation? Are you looking for something for sight singing?
Yeah.
I don't know. I wouldn't know where to start.
I've used Raiders of the Lost Ark before, actually. That's a good one. And they know it sort of usually, so they can. It makes it easier for them to sort of review it in their mind.
Yeah.
And it's not easy, but it's not hard. So. Yeah.
When I'm talking about parallelisms and parallel thirds, I use the Rocky fanfare.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
I feel like we need to have all these little musical clips in the actual
Yes.
We tried to do the Godfather theme. Some of the ranges are difficult, though. So, a lot of times, if you try to take a melody, or we tried to do some Zelda excerpts, but then it was just getting too high or too low, and then it's nice to have something that's really truly singable if you're going to do it in aural class, either for dictation or whatnot. But yeah, that's a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right, so mine is thinking in maybe 50, 75 years, what are the kind of film scores or movies that are going to be kind of become canon as far as, they are going to be what we're talking about in music theory, music history, kind of like, we have Brahms pieces or Beethoven's pieces that, we always talk about the Wolfstein sonata, or we always talk about, a certain Mozart sonata form. What film score or film do you think will have that kind of place for us looking ahead?
Well, I mean, obviously John Williams is the name that everyone will recognize the most. He's, just like Beethoven. I mean, everyone knows a little bit about Beethoven. So John Williams, of course, his music will endure the test of time. I can't remember who it was who used to say on the radio that all music was once new, right? And it's a music that endures because people support it with their concert tickets or their buying recordings or downloading things and so on. So what the audience will support is what will endure, and there will be some from Max Steiner and Casablanca will still be well known and recognized and loved in 50 or 75 years. The Italian Westerns, I think so. I'm optimistic. When they first came out, the critics hated them, but then they had a cult following. But they've really become part of serious academic study. So yeah, the Italian Westerns and Morricone and his contemporaries. But the Hollywood sound, like I alluded to earlier, is so many different sounds. It's jazz and it's rock and roll and it's orchestral. But I believe, compared to a lot of other pop music, that film music will be, like I mentioned before we started today, that film music will be thought of as the classical music of our time.
Yeah. Do you think that has to do with the instrumentation, because often not is orchestral, or is there something else that makes it kind of quote unquote classical to you in your mind?
Oh, now that is a good question, because there is that trend back towards the big symphony orchestras, sure. and they fell out of style in the 60s and 70s and 80s when you had pop music, and it really started with High Noon and Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling. That had a movie theme song was a hit song on the radio, right. And that never happened before. And then you have the Beatles movies in the 60s and then in the 70s, Fame and Flashdance and all the MTV era films. And then now we have, Spike Lee and film music that is hip hop and funk. And there's just so many genres that are under the umbrella of film music. It's really hard to say that this film music is this, or this film music in the future will be that, because there's so many different. It just covers too many things. Yeah. So it's hard to generalize. But when I think of the music that will endure, yeah, I'm probably thinking of the big orchestral sounds, Michael Giacchino, James Horner. I love Michael Giacchino. He likes to write for big orchestras. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. So as we wrap up, maybe let our listeners know a little bit about maybe some other project that you're working on, or other projects that you have out that you could direct our listeners to, and then also where listeners might be able to reach out to you if they have questions or want to learn more about what you're up to.
Okay. Well, I'm on Facebook. I have I could give out my email address. Is that what?
Sure. Yeah.
Charles L. at utep.edu. Well, what was the other part of your question?
Maybe kind of the projects that you've completed, or anything that you have currently working on.
For the last 8 years, I was the sole undergraduate music advisor. So my research was kind of on the back burner, and I had a few things that I started earlier that kind of made some progress. but I'm actually right now looking for, a new research project. I might revisit Max Steiner. Ennio Morricone passed away a couple years ago, which is very sad. But he had a long life and wrote a lot of great music, and I'm thankful for that. And but there's some challenges to writing about a living composer too, because what you write now may not be true in the future as they continue to compose and evolve and innovate. So I'll have to get back to you on what my next big project will be.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess I know that was the last question, but I am curious as just as you brought up the last point, I think for music theorists, so often we are researching music that has been written by dead people, right? You've
Yes.
had the opportunity to analyze and research music by a living composer, which you just mentioned is challenging, right? Because things can change. But what are your recommendations for music theorists who would be interested in trying to or analyze music that's composed by a living composer and maybe reaching out to them?
Yeah, I would encourage that probably over any kind of archival research of something that's been written in long ago. Because there's so many questions that we can't ask the composers, and man, if we could just ask them a few more questions, how great that would be. So if you can seek out and find a living composer, and there are living composers, and I think in general composers are nice people, and they don't mind if you ask questions. That would really be exciting, and I would strongly encourage that. Like I'll tell composer theory students, that we don't double the leading tone, right? And well, the great composers didn't do it, and if they were here, we could ask them why. But I can tell you it doesn't sound good. But why do they not? What don't they like about the similar octaves? Well, if they were here, we could ask them, but they're not. So, but this is our theory based on our study of the music of the past, that we notice that 9 out of 10 times they avoid that thing, so there must be something about it, and that's our theory. But asking a living composer about their music, and like I said, in general, I think composers are nice people, and they'd be willing to answer a lot of questions. So
I'll add one
yes, seek
story
out
to
living
this.
composers.
In this exact regard, I had my research partner last year, Xiao Yun, who's an excellent film music researcher, and I was so lucky to partner with Sean for our paper. Developed this whole theory of like key schemes in some Bruce Broughton scores, and he went and asked Bruce about was this a particular key scheme between like the scenes that you had crafted for this such and such reason, and then Bruce said, no, it's entirely based on the timbre of the low brass. What note wanted to be the arrival of this low brassy timbre, and that was the reason why the keys were structured in the way they were. You just think, okay. It was not a tonal structuring reason. It was a timbre reason. Yeah. And you would have probably not known it, but then you ask the person and they tell you.
That kind of puts into question all theories right there. Are we all just making stuff up? Was Bach thinking of something totally different? And we've been saying this one thing because we can't ask him. Makes me nervous.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I thought that was interesting add on.
You just made it to the end of another episode of Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and review the podcast, and you can always reach us at notedoctorspodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or show ideas. Thanks for listening.